So, Sally Lieber, thank you very much for coming in and your candidacy for the 13th Senate District. I think a logical place to start is the fact that you are a prior Assemblywoman and also ran for this very seat 8 years ago in 2012, sorry, I lost a decade there, against Jerry Hill, the incumbent who is now termed out. And in that race, you lost by a pretty significant margin. I think it was about 30 points. And I'm wondering what has led you to believe that you can be more successful this time around and how your tactics may change to try to do that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here. And as you point out, I've served in the State Assembly. I was there for 3 terms before I was termed out. And then I did run for State Senate in 2012 in this district. It was quickly following on the heels of a redistricting. And I was initially running in a district that went from Mountain View through Gilroy. But during the process of the campaign, the district was switched to be Sunnyvale to South San Francisco. So a pretty dramatic change, but one that I was really pleased with because I love this district on the peninsula. I had the chance to meet a lot of people. And even though I was outspent more than 10 to 1, I still got about 40% of the vote against someone who was a perceived incumbent because he was in the State Assembly. So I still find that I have a lot of name ID throughout the peninsula and have had the chance to meet a lot of great people in all the cities that make up this district.
And how would you critique Jerry Hill's service in the Senate? How would you have voted differently than he or somehow represented the district differently had you been elected?
Well, I think he's been very strong in the state Senate. He's been very vocal, and I think he's been successful at reforms to the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, which has been critically important. Some outstanding issues that are still left are how to make real changes to PG&E, something that's proved to be a more difficult task. And I think that I start from the position of being much more of an environmentalist. So, for example, in contrast, I strongly support a ban on fracking and will carry my environmental values into the state Senate.
Before we leave the topic of Jerry Hill's activities, you mentioned his work on PG&E, and I'm wondering what your solution is to the current PG&E dilemma and whether you see public ownership of PG&E as being a viable option. Where do we go from here with?
I'm not sure that public ownership of PG&E is the answer and that asking the public to pick up PG&E's deficits and debts is the right way to go. But it is very clear to me that we need publicly owned power that is locally, renewably generated and locally stored. And we can't rely on the antiquated systems that we have. Our grid has been developed over time in a very complex way. And I think that we need to, rather than trying to make a major change in the grid, look at models outside of that. And it's become very clear to me that PG&E is just absolutely recalcitrant. They are outside of any kind of acceptable norms or morals. And so we have to work around them and not nurse them along.
So you obviously support these community power entities that are forming throughout the state.
Yeah, I think that no one really anticipated the viability of community choice aggregation and how successful it's been as a model. But those aggregators are still reliant on PG&E's transmission lines. And that's why we've seen the public power or the public safety shutoffs, despite the fact that we have thriving small utilities operating. And so I think we have to look at completely different models where those aggregators are producing power locally and storing it locally. And that has to go for rural California as well, because that's why we have the transmission lines going through forests.
So would you impose, if elected to the legislature, would you support imposing certain new requirements on PG&E in exchange for allowing them to continue as a private utility?
Oh, I think that we have to put the most stringent conditions on them possible, but also never trust that organization, because they've proven themselves untrustworthy time after time. There was a very good article in the Wall Street Journal back in July about the fact that PG&E knew that the problems with their system were likely to cause massive fires that would cause death, injury, loss of property, loss of wildlife habitat, and they have not taken a different tact.
Well, in theory, it's regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, and so what more stringent requirements would you propose be imposed on them?
I think that we have to require that they use better technology to have surveillance of lines, that they use artificial intelligence and aggregate data in a more powerful and robust way to predict where line failures will happen. And they must do this. And it's been a couple of years of hearings in the state legislature. I do think that the governor is very serious about it. And he has designated Ana Mata Santos, who was very key in the finance department previously, who's probably one of the smartest people in state government, to spearhead this effort. And the PUC now has very strong and capable staff working on it. It hasn't always been the case that the PUC was ready to take action because they were more of a captive body to the investor-owned utilities. I do have confidence in what's going on now, but we need to really press on PG&E. We can't give them a decade of power shutoffs to cure their problems.
So switching topics to housing, one of the most controversial bills in the Senate last year was, of course, SB 50. And there have been some modifications made to it recently in order to try to get it onto the Senate floor. If you were in the Senate right now, how would you be trying to shape SB 50?
Well, I think that a big lack within SB 50 has been ensuring affordable housing as part of the mix, and there have been some amendments towards that. I am watching all of the amendments closely, and at some points things are in and then they're out and then they're back in. So I'm watching it very closely. I would defer making a final decision until I saw the final product. I was really disappointed that smaller counties were taken out at one point to secure votes and now are back in where they should be. But I think that those kinds of twists and turns in a bill are what deteriorates public faith in the process. And there are a lot of people on the peninsula who are watching this bill really closely, and I think that that's how it should be.
Yeah. You mentioned affordable housing. Is there a specific mechanism that you'd like to see added?
Well, I would like to see a great deal more of extremely low-income housing and low-income housing. Probably not within this bill, but I think within the legislature's work, I'd like to see more of a requirement that when public properties are used, the surplus properties, and I think surface parking lots should be included in that there would be a requirement for affordable housing and a high requirement for affordable housing. Mm-hmm. If you look at just the numbers in terms of housing production, a lot of the communities in our area are doing what they can towards it. Not everyone is, but many communities are. But when you look at the production of low-income affordable housing and extremely low-income affordable housing, it's almost non-existent. And for years we've used the near Central Valley as our pressure release valve. And I think that we can't do that forever because the economies of those cities are going to increase to the point that individuals who are living there don't need to come and travel for hours per day to be healthcare workers in Silicon Valley. They can do it in Modesto and Fresno and other cities.
So a lot of the problems with spurring affordable housing is just the financial incentives and the financial costs that make it sort of less worth it for developers. So are there specific incentives that you're envisioning that don't already exist for affordable housing developers?
Well, I think that we need more new funding to renovate existing buildings and to allow purchases by nonprofit developers. We've seen in our area where that's been very successful over time. There has been some state legislation to streamline the process of getting more housing that has been problematic because it's ignored the fact of whether it's affordable housing or market rate housing. And so we've seen some displacements recently around that because one more unit of housing was added, even though it would be absolutely positively out of the reach of the people that currently live on that property.
So one of the tensions, I think, with SB 50 and other approaches to spurring housing is just whether or not cities have failed. And if cities have failed, should there be certain mandates that aren't already in place to punish cities, fine cities that aren't stepping up to meet their RHNA needs?
I think that we need to have some kind of mechanism, but it has to include things like cities having control over design. Also, it may be possible to reward certain cities for doing more. The cities that are closer to transit obviously should have more of a responsibility. And also keying it to adding jobs, I think is something that's really necessary.
What about banning jobs?
Banning jobs, I think if you say that you have to have the housing to add the jobs, that's going to be enough of an incentive to not overgrow on the jobs front.
So I can understand why you aren't able to take a position on the moving target of SB 50, and plus it'll be resolved obviously before this election takes place in its current form at least. Mm-hmm. But to Jocelyn's point, what are you prepared to approve at the state level that would impose requirements on the cities of our district? Mm-hmm. I mean, SB 50 does that, and I understand incentives, but at what point do you support actual requirements of cities?
Well, right now we have the RHNA numbers that are supposed to be an actual requirement for cities. We know that many cities are not actually leading to the construction of those units. Right. And part of it is getting developers who are willing to build. So I think that we should be enforcing those numbers. I am much more...
But what does that mean? How are you going to enforce those numbers?
Well, I think it could be something like linking it to getting transportation dollars. It could be fining cities who are not compliant and have no plan to do so with their RHNA numbers. I just think that the machinations with one bill can't suck all the oxygen out of the room. And currently that's what SB 50 is doing. And there have been a lot of other good bills that have come up, some of which have gotten through the legislature by virtue of so much attention going to SB 50. I think that the bill that got through in terms of rent control statewide and in terms of just cause eviction was a good example of that because so many people were so fixated on SB 50. And I think that there is the process exists for a reason. If a bill is in as much trouble as SB 50 is, then it probably does need to be broken down into multiple bills. Be a 2-year bill, as this one is. I was very glad when this was made a 2-year bill because I think it merits a lot more conversation. And look at what is possible to do. Not where can we be stuck on SB 50, but what is possible to do. And I think that, for example, we should be looking at the surface parking lots of Caltrain. And those exist all up and down the peninsula. It's an opportunity for affordable housing, but it would require legislation.
Shifting gears slightly, but still on the housing general topic, the polls show that homelessness is one of the public's greatest concerns. Governor Newsom has made this a big priority. He's just finished this statewide tour to discuss it and the solutions to it, and he's allocating $1 billion to the problem. What is your solution to government's response, and especially the role of local government in terms of dealing with this issue?
Well, in the Bay Area in general, we've had a housing first philosophy, and it's been a philosophy of backing away from shelter space and going for permanent housing, which is very well intentioned, but it's led to thousands of people being on the streets. And so I think that there is a role for shelters, for stabilizing people that need it. We need just about every layer of housing. And I think that we need to go back to the model of the YW and YMCA kind of model, where it's a small private room with supportive services on the first floor. And that's not something that you find any longer on the peninsula. You find it in a for-profit model in San Francisco in the SROs, which are not well done and don't give people a good example to work from. But I think that we need to recreate that kind of model for the people who need it. Right now, the shelters that we have are not accessible by transit. They are generally in warehouse areas that are not safe for women in particular to get to. They are not adjacent to schools and services for children. And so I think that we need to do better on that. And we need to admit that we need all of these different layers. The RVs are going to be a part of our housing mix going forward. So we have to have local communities figuring out a way to live with them. And that's why I've taken a position against Mountain View's ban on the RVs. I think that we have to look at the numbers of how many families are doubled up, tripled up, quadrupled up in apartments, and make sure that they're counted into our unhoused numbers. And I think that we need a lot more shelter space that is for women and children, too.
So would you support mandating local communities to provide shelters and send some state funding to them in order to do that, and safe parking programs? That's Newsom's commission apparently is going to recommend that there be mandates issued by the state.
Yeah, I think that has to be a given. And I very much support London Breed's proposal to have increased use of conservatorship. And I think that for many individuals who have a mental illness or who have been out on the street for a very long time, if you were able to show them a videotape of their lives, they would say, yes, please get me out of this. And the treatment is successful, and having a laddered approach of shelter space that leads to more permanent housing in conjunction with preserving the housing that people have. That will always be the fastest way to get people into housing, is keeping them in the housing that they have. And really addressing the situation in a lot of areas in the Bay Area where we have so many vacant units while we have so many people that are homeless, I think is something that we need to pursue.
So just to be clear, you would vote to impose requirements on cities to provide shelters and safe parking areas?
I think shelters regionally, accessible to transit, and safe parking as a mandate. And I think that we also have to look at the fact that our public transportation is used as a shelter, and require that our transit agencies have protocols around that. And that's a fact of life in the Bay Area, in particular for women who are not going to go to a shelter that is in a darkened industrial area rather than be on the 22 bus or the ECR bus in San Mateo County.
One of the proposals in Newsom's budget is to prevent people from becoming homeless by paying for their rent for a while. Do you favor that? It sounds like you do. What kind of accountability measures should be built into that so that taxpayer funding isn't going in perpetuity to people who, for whatever reason, are perpetually at risk of homelessness?
Yeah, I think that having casework done with the person is the key there. The community agencies have always provided that kind of emergency funding. And when I was in the state assembly, I had many constituent cases where someone just needed a small amount of funding to save their housing, to do other things. But there are so many factors that work into that. If you look at the price of childcare in the Bay Area right now, it's either housing or childcare. For so many families, they're under so much pressure. And those are the families that we have on El Camino in the RVs. And I recently saw a news article coming from the payday lenders that the biggest market for payday lenders are young families who use childcare and are perpetually behind financially because there are not enough subsidized childcare slots. And the governor in his budget is providing a lot more money for childcare, but it doesn't go anywhere towards the need that we have for subsidized care.
Shifting gears, are you a supporter of what AB 5 has done to deal with the issue of independent contractors versus employees? As you know, this was a measure that implemented a Supreme Court decision that sort of went beyond what a lot of people feel was the scope of the issue in front of them. But this is creating a lot of confusion and a lot of controversy. Are you comfortable with AB 5 and as it exists today?
I would have voted for AB 5. And I'm a supporter of addressing the issue of people being caught in the gig economy and not having the supports that come from employment. Way back when I was in the Walmart, the movie, because I was the first person to raise the issue of what Walmart was doing, of fast-tracking people onto public services. And making that a strong part of their business model. So I think that we have to have ways of addressing what has become almost a Dickensian economy, where there are a very few people at the top who are hyper wealthy, and then very little middle class, and a huge class of struggling working people. And so this is one of the mechanisms. I know that there are going to be lawsuits. It's going to be caught up in court. etc. But I think it starts the conversation, and that's something that has to happen. In the Bay Area, we tend to be very enamored with how great high tech is and how much money it's producing and the wealth that it's producing for a very few people. And we don't do as good of a job at looking at the impacts of that. And that has come about as a result of this bill. So I am strongly in favor of that.
So do you not believe that there are many, many people that prefer to work as an independent contractor, as freelancers, that this is their choice? They want to be Uber drivers. They want to be freelance photographers. What do you say to those people who view this as just interfering with their ability to make a living?
Yeah, I think that there are definitely folks that are in that group, and they were up in the Capitol in a very strong way. And this bill went through the process. It came out where it came out. It will clearly be continue to be fought out in the courts. It will probably be fine-tuned in the legislature. And I know that in particular, motion picture industry, etc., have some issues with it. But there has to be a starting point of getting at what's happening to our California economy, what's happening to the fact that we have almost no middle class, and that has always been a part of the California economy until now.
But how does this solve that issue? I mean, for a company to then have to employ a very part-time worker, that doesn't in any way deal with that issue.
Yeah, I think that this is a starting point. It's not the finish point. I don't think that the legislature is going to stop work on the issue now and just fight it out in the courts and let whatever the courts decide be the standpoint. I think it's going to be vigorously debated all along, and it's a big topic, and sometimes things don't get finished or aren't correct with one bill, and then you come back and keep working on the issue.
I want to turn our attention to criminal justice for a second. One of the day-to-day concerns in Palo Alto are the increase in auto burglaries, break-ins, which people attribute to Prop 47. And there is an initiative on the ballot, California Criminal Sentencing Initiative, that would reform some of the Prop 47 and Prop 57, I believe, regulations. So what is your stance on how effective and successful Prop 47 has been, and whether or not there needs to be any kind of reform of that?
Yeah, I think that we do need some fine-tuning, in particular on the auto burglaries. What I've read is that one of the issues is that if you can't prove that the individual broke into the car and that the car wasn't unlocked, then it can't be prosecuted. And that's empowering folks to go out and commit very large numbers of break-ins that can be very impactful for people's lives. And so I think that needs to be fine-tuned. And then hand in hand with that, we have to address all of the other criminal justice issues that are out there. We have to look at our addiction to over-incarceration of people in California and see who should be out of prison, who got very long prison sentences when they were 19 years old and they're now 80 years old and they're still in our prisons. I think that we have to really look at the issue of criminality of young people that get caught up in the system and what can be done to work in a positive manner with them. I think Santa Clara County has done a great job on changing some of the protocols around that and keeping some of the youth in juvenile hall past the date that they would have normally gone on to the adult system and having the chance to work with them more. And we have to look at why young people get into the system in the first place, and what can be done when parents are drug addicted, when parents have gang involvement, particularly when there are multiple gangs within the family that people have affiliations to. And I know that the governor has proposed closing one of the prisons. I think that we need to approach that with caution and look at the fact that all of our institutions are well over their design capacity. And rather than just have the splash of closing one, look at how can we actually get people out of prison that should no longer be there, and how can we prevent people from coming into the system.
Related to Jocelyn's question about crime, as you know, the state legislature passed a law that makes the release of body cam footage from police officers that are involved in shootings to be made public. Would you support a strengthening of that law so that body cam footage under other circumstances would be mandated to be released once investigations were complete? So, for example, allegations of excessive force or just any other issue that arises that would benefit from having body cam footage available to the public. Would you support that kind of legislation?
So to clarify, that would be, for example, releasing video of someone's arrest when they have not made an allegation of excessive force.
Potentially. That could be one example.
Yeah, I think that should be navigated very carefully. Mm-hmm. There are commercial entities that take mugshots of individuals before they've been convicted of a crime or even charged, and put those out on the web for sale. And so I think we need to look at the impact on individuals. If someone is living with a mental illness, what they're like in a mental health crisis and at the point of arrest may not be what they're like in the rest of their life.
Yeah, I was thinking of cases where the person depicted wanted it released and the police were refusing to release it. You're pointing out some examples of where that wouldn't be a good outcome.
Yeah, if the person depicted wants to have it released, then I think that would be fair to do. But I can think of many examples where it could be monetized and used in the wrong way as well. So that would be a path that would need to be navigated.
Mm-hmm. Can we do a lightning round?
Yes, that's a good idea because we only have a couple minutes.
Okay. Regarding state debt, we've got $400 billion in state and city government liabilities, unfunded pensions, and retiree health care. Do you think that the state is doing enough to put aside money so that our children and our children's generations won't have to shoulder this burden?
I don't think that we are, and the security of pensions is something that I'm very concerned about. I do think that we need to have additional precautions in place for the local governments that make that decision without necessarily looking at the future economic conditions. When I was in the state assembly, we went through the largest budget shortfall of any state in U.S. history, and it really scared me about what can happen in a downturn. And I'm very pleased that the legislature since then has come back with really setting aside money in a rainy day fund. I think that we need to do more on the pension side of things to make sure that we're okay. Mm-hmm. When I was on city council and mayor, we started what some people criticized us for, having too sizable of a rainy day fund. That ended up carrying the city through the downturn intact.
I'd like to just fire a few questions at you,
Sure.
and I realize
Shorten
that
them up.
there's probably a lot of detail you could give, but the cannabis tax, would you favor reducing the cannabis tax to try to deal with the problems that exist now with the black market sales overwhelming the legal sales?
The cannabis tax is not something, the level of it is not something that I've thought about, so I will take a look at that.
Okay. The school start mandate that has been adopted for the year 2022, are you supportive of that? And would you expect that to actually be implemented?
Yeah, I think that we need to have the later start times for wellness of youth and mental health and stress levels.
And the idea of the state mandating that is, in your mind, an appropriate thing. Jump in with any other.
Yeah, when it comes to healthcare costs, do you favor the state manufacturing generic drugs?
Yes, absolutely.
Carbon tax?
Yeah, absolutely. We need it. We need oil extraction, we need a carbon tax, we need to have all the incentives in place. I was a very active co-author of AB 32 to start to put a price on polluting the atmosphere, and it's been a good mechanism, but there's much more that we need to do. And a world of strategies that are out there for our vehicle fleet and transportation.
How about mandates to move to electrical appliances, hot water heaters,
Absolutely.
all of that? That's now, now taking place at the local level. You'd support state action in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in an existential crisis with climate collapse, and I authored the legislation to create the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, which was not an easy thing at a time when the governor was really committed to doing away with all state agencies, to say that we needed one. But we need strategies across the board to deal with climate and to slow the collapse in any possible way that we can.
Tax reform, do you favor the split roll?
Yes, absolutely. We need it.
Newsom's Delta water plan, that he wants to do a single door tunnel after having scrapped Brown's more ambitious plan.
I think it's very problematic environmentally, and we need to rely more on aggressive conservation and recycling of water. And I think it's regrettable that he's backtracked environmentally.
On healthcare, medical insurance for undocumented aged residents?
Yes, absolutely.
All undocumented residents?
I think we need we need Medicare for all in our state. If you eat in a restaurant in California or buy food at the grocery store, you're buying something that has been handled by a person who's undocumented, and I want them to have health care services.
Paid family leave requirements for private employers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you think that there are the votes to pass that in the legislature?
Yeah, I think that the support is definitely there, and it needs to be something that people can actually use.
Okay, can we thank you very much for coming in and for answering our questions. It's great to see you again.
Thank you so much.